My name is Margaret Whitmore, and I am 72 years old. For most of my life, I believed I lived a storybook marriage. My husband, Charles Whitmore, and I were married for 40 long years. We built a life together, raised 2 children, bought a modest but warm home in Vermont, and spent every holiday surrounded by family. To anyone on the outside, we were the perfect picture of love and longevity. But life has a way of revealing truths when you least expect them. Sometimes, those truths are so devastating, they strip away everything you thought you knew about yourself, about love, and about loyalty. That is what happened to me. It all began on a cold February morning. Charles passed away suddenly at the age of 75. A heart attack in his sleep, the doctor said. One moment, I was tucking the blanket over his shoulders, and the next moment, I was dialing 911, my hands trembling, my heart pounding in disbelief. I mourned him the way any wife would. I cried until my eyes were raw, and I whispered to myself that at least we had 40 years together. I thought I had lost the love of my life, the man who was my anchor. But I had no idea that his death was only the beginning of the nightmare. A week after his funeral, I met with our family lawyer, Henry Collins, to go over Charles's will. I wasn't worried. Years ago, Charles had promised me that the house, his savings, and his pension would keep me comfortable for the rest of my life. I walked into Henry's office expecting reassurance. Instead, I walked out shattered. Henry slid the papers across his desk and said in a heavy voice, "Margaret, there's something you need to prepare yourself for. Charles updated his will 3 years ago. Almost everything is left to someone else." I stared at him in disbelief. "What do you mean, someone else? Who?" Henry looked at me with pity. "A woman named Isabella Hart." The name meant nothing to me. But as I read the document, my hands shook. My husband of 40 years had left the house, his investments, his bank accounts, and even his prized antique cars to this woman. All I was given was a small monthly allowance, barely enough to survive. My grief turned instantly into a new kind of heartbreak. Who was Isabella Hart? I didn't have to wait long to find out. She appeared at Charles's funeral, standing quietly in the back row, dressed in black silk. At the time, I assumed she was some distant acquaintance. But when I later confronted her, she smiled in the cruelest way. "We loved each other, Margaret," she said. "Charles and I had something real. Something you could never understand." Her words sliced through me like knives. 40 years of sacrifice, 40 years of standing by him through sickness and health, 40 years of raising children together, and he had been sharing his heart, his bed, and his promises with someone else. At first I was numb. I stopped eating. I sat alone in the kitchen, staring at the chair where Charles used to sip his morning coffee. My children, Evelyn and Thomas, tried to comfort me, but they were just as shocked. Evelyn whispered, "Mom, we'll figure this out. We'll fight it." But what was there to fight? The will was legal. Isabella had the upper hand. She moved into my house like a queen claiming her throne. She drove Charles's car through town as if parading her prize. Every time I saw her, my stomach twisted with rage. The memories replayed in my head endlessly. Every late night Charles claimed he had to work. Every business trip that lasted longer than expected. Every faint trace of perfume that wasn't mine. For years, the signs were there, but I was too trusting to see them. My grief hardened into anger. And one night, as I sat clutching a faded photograph of our wedding day, I whispered to myself, "No, Margaret. You will not let this woman steal the life you built. If Charles betrayed you, he will not have the last word. Isabella Hart will not walk away with everything." That was the moment I decided to fight back. Not with tears, not with begging, but with strategy. The first step was information. I met with Henry again and demanded, "Tell me everything. When did Charles change his will? What are my options?" Henry sighed and explained, "Margaret, the will is legally binding. But there are loopholes. If we can prove undue influence, fraud, or coercion, we might challenge it. But it will be a long and painful battle." His words echoed in my mind. Long and painful battle. But what was the alternative? To let Isabella enjoy the fruits of my 40 years of loyalty? Never. I agreed to pursue the case. At the same time, I began digging into Isabella's past. I talked to neighbors, old co-workers of Charles, even some of her acquaintances. The picture that emerged was ugly. Isabella had a history of relationships with older wealthy men, And somehow, each time, she walked away richer. This wasn't about love. It was about greed. She had seduced Charles and convinced him to change his will. The realization made my blood boil, but it also gave me strength. One afternoon, I decided to confront her. I drove to what used to be my home and found her sitting on the porch, sipping wine. I said calmly, "You don't belong here." She smirked. "Neither do you. Charles chose me. Maybe you should learn to accept it." I smiled back, but my voice was steady. "Enjoy it while you can, Isabella. Because soon, everything you think you own will slip right through your fingers." She laughed at me, dismissing my words, but I saw a flicker of unease in her eyes. With Henry's help, I started gathering evidence. We uncovered bank transfers, gifts, even a secret apartment Charles paid for. All in Isabella's name. My stomach turned as I read through the details, but I felt vindicated. This was proof. Proof that she had manipulated him, drained him, and stolen from me. Henry reassured me, "This is enough to build a strong case. We can show the court that Isabella preyed on Charles in his vulnerable years." But I wanted more than just a legal victory. I wanted her to feel the same devastation she had inflicted on me. I wanted her to crumble under the weight of her own arrogance. That desire fueled me more than grief ever had. As I prepared for the battle ahead, something inside me shifted. I realized I wasn't just fighting for money or property. I was fighting for my dignity, for the 40 years I had given to a man who betrayed me, for the respect I deserved as his wife. And I made a silent promise to myself. I will not be the victim of this story. The days after my decision to fight back were some of the hardest of my life. Grief still weighed on me, but it was now laced with determination. Every time I looked at Isabella flaunting what once belonged to me, every time I remembered Charles's betrayal, my resolve hardened. I no longer saw myself as a widow mourning her husband. I saw myself as a woman preparing for war. Henry guided me through the legal process. "Margaret," he said one afternoon, "we'll need witnesses, people who can testify about Isabella's influence over Charles. We'll need to demonstrate that he was manipulated, that his decisions weren't entirely his own." His words gave me hope. For the first time since Charles's death, I felt like maybe justice wasn't so far away. I started by reaching out to old friends of ours. One by one, I asked them if they had ever noticed anything suspicious. To my surprise, several of them admitted they had seen Charles with Isabella at restaurants, at charity galas, even traveling together. They had said nothing out of respect for me, thinking it wasn't their place to interfere. Hearing it made my stomach twist, but it also armed me with truth. My daughter Evelyn stood by my side through it all. "Mom, we're going to get through this," she said. Her voice reminded me of my younger self, strong, determined, unwilling to bow down. My son Thomas, quieter but just as supportive, promised to testify if needed. "Dad was careless," he admitted. "He thought he was invincible. But we'll make sure she doesn't get away with this." Their loyalty gave me strength. One evening, while going through Charles's belongings, I discovered a small notebook hidden at the back of his desk drawer. Inside were notes, meetings, dates, and even small love letters he had written to Isabella. Each page burned in my hands, not because of his words, but because I realized how deep her control had been. In the margins, I saw reminders to change his accounts, to transfer funds, to make arrangements for her. It was as if she had orchestrated every step. I showed the notebook to Henry, and his eyes widened. "This is powerful, Margaret. It shows a pattern. We can argue she had undue influence over his decisions. A judge will take this seriously." My heart lifted slightly. Maybe Charles's betrayal would finally be turned into my advantage. But Isabella wasn't going to stay quiet. She had money, charm, and a vicious tongue. She hired an expensive lawyer, a man named Richard Hale, known for being ruthless in court. I still remember the first time I saw her after the case was filed. She approached me outside the courthouse, her lips curved into a cold smile. "You think you can beat me, Margaret?" she sneered. "Charles chose me. The courts will see that. You're just a bitter old woman who can't accept reality." Her words stung, but I refused to show weakness. I looked her in the eye and said calmly, "You underestimate me, Isabella. That's your first mistake. The second was thinking you could steal 40 years of my life without consequences." She laughed and walked away, But I knew I had unsettled her. The trial preparation consumed my days. Henry gathered evidence, while I focused on staying strong. I forced myself to eat again, to sleep when I could, to keep my mind sharp. I couldn't let her see me crumble. Evelyn and Thomas helped collect documents, receipts, and anything that tied Isabella to my husband's financial downfall. Piece by piece, we built a mountain of evidence. The first hearing was brutal. Isabella sat confidently in her designer suit, her lawyer arguing that she had been Charles's true love, that he had every right to leave his estate to her. They painted me as a woman clinging to bitterness, someone who couldn't let go. I clenched my fists, biting my tongue, waiting for our turn. When Henry stood, his voice was steady and clear. He presented the bank transfers, the lavish gifts, the secret apartment. He showed the notebook, with Charles's handwriting documenting Isabella's influence. The courtroom grew silent. I watched Isabella's face. Her smirk faltered for the first time. She whispered angrily to her lawyer, her confidence cracking. That moment gave me the strength to sit taller, to breathe deeper. This wasn't just about winning property. It was about showing her that she could not erase me from my own life story. But the battle wasn't over. Isabella retaliated by spreading lies. She claimed I had been a cold, neglectful wife. She whispered rumors in town, trying to tarnish my name. For a moment, I worried people would believe her. But then something unexpected happened. Neighbors, old friends, even members of our church began reaching out to me, offering their support. "We know the truth, Margaret," one of them said. "We saw what she was doing all these years. You don't deserve this." Their words gave me the community I thought I had lost. One night, as I sat with Evelyn by the fire, she asked me softly, "Mom, why are you fighting so hard? Is it really about the money?" I looked into her eyes and shook my head. "It's about respect. Your father threw me away like I was nothing, after I gave him 40 years of my life. Isabella thinks she can erase me, but I refuse to disappear. This fight is not just for me. It's for every woman who has ever been betrayed and cast aside." Evelyn squeezed my hand, tears in her eyes. "Then we'll fight together." The trial dragged on for weeks. Each day felt like a battle of endurance. Isabella's lawyer tried every trick: delays, objections, twisting of facts. But Henry was relentless. He exposed inconsistencies in her story. He highlighted her past relationships with wealthy men who mysteriously left her richer. Piece by piece, her facade began to crack. During one particularly tense session, Henry presented testimony from one of Charles's old colleagues. The man revealed that Charles had confided in him about Isabella, admitting that she pressured him constantly, threatening to leave if he didn't provide for her. "He seemed trapped," the colleague said. "It wasn't love. It was fear of losing her." That testimony shifted the entire courtroom. I saw jurors exchanging glances, their expressions hardening toward Isabella. Outside the courthouse, reporters began to gather. The story of a widow fighting against her husband's mistress drew attention. At first, I hated the spotlight, but soon I realized it was helping. The more people learned about Isabella's schemes, the more pressure she felt. She tried to avoid cameras, but her once proud posture now looked fragile. One evening, Henry came to my house with news. "Margaret, Isabella's lawyer approached me today. They want to negotiate a settlement." My heart raced. A settlement meant she was scared of losing everything. I asked, "What does she want?" Henry explained that she was willing to return a portion of the estate if I dropped the case. For a moment, the thought tempted me. After all, I was exhausted. The idea of ending it quickly was appealing. But then I thought of Charles's notebook, of the lies, of Isabella smirking in my face. No, a settlement wasn't enough. "Tell her no," I said firmly. "We're going to the end. She needs to lose everything." Henry smiled faintly. "I thought you'd say that." The following week in court, Isabella's composure finally shattered. Under cross-examination, Henry cornered her with financial records she couldn't explain. He asked why Charles, a man known for being frugal, suddenly began draining his accounts for her. He asked why she had been listed as the sole beneficiary while his wife of 40 years was left nearly penniless. Her answers were evasive, her voice cracking under pressure. For the first time the mask slipped. She looked less like a grieving lover and more like what she truly was, a predator. As I watched her unravel, I felt a surge of satisfaction. It wasn't joy, not exactly. It was something deeper. A sense that justice was finally catching up. For so long, I had been the silent victim. But now, I was the one in control. Still, I knew the battle wasn't finished. The judge had yet to make a ruling, and Isabella was desperate. Desperate people are dangerous. I braced myself for what might come next. At home that night, I looked around the quiet house, my children asleep in their old rooms, and whispered to myself, "You're almost there, Margaret. Just a little longer. Hold on." The morning sun streamed through the large bay windows of the Whitmore estate, casting golden light across the polished wooden floors. Margaret Whitmore sat at the breakfast table, her hands folded, her eyes staring into the empty cup of tea in front of her. The house was quiet, too quiet for her liking. Ever since Charles had changed the will, the atmosphere had shifted, a heavy tension lingering in every corner. Even the walls seemed to whisper secrets that should have remained buried. For 42 years, Margaret had dedicated herself entirely to her husband, Charles, a man whose charm had never faded. Yet, in his final years, that charm had turned to something she hadn't anticipated. Cold, calculated betrayal. Isabella Hart, the young woman who had crept into their lives, had become the unfortunate recipient of everything Margaret and Charles had built together. Margaret's heart ached, but she was no longer the fragile woman she had been in her youth. Margaret stood and walked to the window, her reflection staring back at her. Her gray hair was neatly tied, her posture strong. She took a deep breath. The time for passive sorrow had ended. She had always believed that revenge was a dish best served cold, and now the moment had arrived. She had spent weeks carefully gathering information. Isabella Hart, oblivious to Margaret's growing resolve, had begun enjoying her newfound wealth. Margaret had discovered the bank accounts, the properties, the secret investments, all meticulously listed in the updated will that Charles had made shortly before his passing. And while Isabella had assumed it was all hers by default, she had underestimated Margaret's intelligence, her persistence, and the quiet fire that had never died within her. Margaret's first step was subtle. She began by inserting herself into Isabella's social circles, attending charity events and society gatherings where Isabella thrived. No one suspected the elderly widow of harboring any intentions beyond polite conversation and social niceties. Yet every smile Margaret offered, every word she spoke, was carefully calculated to gather information, to plant seeds of doubt, and to manipulate the young woman into revealing her weaknesses. It was at the annual Whitmore Foundation Gala that Margaret struck her first blow. Isabella, dazzling in a shimmering emerald gown, moved through the crowd with effortless grace. Her laugh, light and airy, filled the room, and Margaret noted every detail. The way she spoke to the trustees, the way she maneuvered conversations to her advantage. After all, Isabella had inherited not just wealth but influence, and Margaret understood that influence could be as powerful as money, if wielded correctly. Margaret approached Isabella with a warm smile. "Isabella, it's so lovely to see you here. I must say, Charles would have been proud of how you're managing everything." Isabella's smile faltered slightly, an instinctive recognition that something about Margaret's tone was off, yet she brushed it aside. "Thank you, Mrs. Whitmore. I hope I can live up to the Whitmore legacy." "Oh, I have no doubt," Margaret replied smoothly. "But tell me, managing such vast estates and investments, it must be overwhelming at times. Do you have someone you trust to advise you?" Isabella hesitated. "Well, I have a few people I rely on, but," she trailed off unsure. Margaret's eyes softened, but inside, every word was a carefully placed trap. Sometimes, having the wrong advisors can cost you more than you think. You must always be vigilant, especially when others see you as inexperienced. The seed was planted. Over the next few weeks, Margaret began sending anonymous tips and subtle warnings, each hinting that Isabella's closest advisors were not entirely trustworthy. Little by little, Isabella's confidence began to waver. Margaret observed from a distance, ensuring that Isabella made decisions driven by anxiety rather than logic. Every mistake Isabella made, Margaret catalogued carefully, knowing they would all serve her eventual plan. Next, Margaret turned her attention to the estate itself. Though Isabella legally owned the Whitmore properties, Margaret had intimate knowledge of every corner, every hidden passage, every historical document that could sway influence. She discovered old contracts, overlooked clauses, and minute legal technicalities that Charles had never fully explained to Isabella. Margaret began consulting a discreet lawyer, crafting a web of legal maneuvers that could challenge Isabella's claims without exposing her own intentions. While the legal groundwork was being prepared, Margaret's social manipulation continued. She reconnected with old friends and colleagues of Charles, those who had been loyal to the Whitmore name for decades. Slowly, she began reminding them of Isabella's inexperience, of minor incidents where Isabella had faltered, all while presenting herself as the concerned, caring widow who simply wanted the Whitmore legacy preserved. Margaret was careful, never overtly accusing, never drawing suspicion. Yet each conversation left Isabella more isolated, more insecure, and increasingly dependent on Margaret's subtle guidance. One evening, Margaret invited Isabella for tea at the estate, a gesture that Isabella accepted eagerly, seeing it as an opportunity to bond with the woman she assumed was harmless. Margaret had prepared meticulously, photographs, letters, and carefully curated stories of Charles's past, all designed to evoke nostalgia and subtly highlight Isabella's shortcomings. "Isabella," Margaret began, pouring tea with precision, "I've been thinking a lot about Charles lately. He was complicated, wasn't he? But he always valued loyalty above all else. I wonder if he would be pleased with how things are going now." Isabella sipped her tea, unsure how to respond. I think so. I'm doing my best, Mrs. Whitmore." Margaret leaned closer, her voice gentle yet laden with intent. "You are doing your best, of course. But sometimes, doing your best isn't enough. Sometimes, we overlook details that can be crucial. You see, Charles always believed that knowledge and wisdom were far more valuable than wealth. I hope you remember that as you make decisions that affect everything he built." Isabella's confidence wavered, and Margaret knew the psychological battle was underway. Over the next month, she orchestrated small incidents, minor legal complications, discreet rumors, and miscommunications that eroded Isabella's control over the Whitmore holdings. Each challenge was crafted to be just believable enough that Isabella could not suspect Margaret's involvement, yet impactful enough to destabilize her. Meanwhile, Margaret's own life had taken on a renewed purpose. She began writing a memoir, ostensibly about her decades with Charles, but within the pages lay veiled warnings and strategic revelations that could one day serve as leverage. Margaret's network grew, her influence returned, and with each passing day, Isabella's authority diminished. The final act of Margaret's plan involved the unveiling of a historical Whitmore document, carefully hidden for generations, which outlined certain conditions regarding inheritance and estate management. Conditions Isabella had unknowingly violated. Margaret, with her lawyer, presented the document in a public forum, ensuring that Isabella's mishandling became a matter of legal and social record. Isabella, unprepared for such scrutiny, was forced to relinquish portions of the Whitmore estate back to Margaret, not just as a matter of legal right, but as a resolution that preserved the family legacy as Charles would have intended. As Isabella Hart retreated from the spotlight, her confidence shattered, Margaret Whitmore stood tall, a woman vindicated not by vengeance alone, but by intelligence, patience, and unwavering resolve. She had transformed betrayal into empowerment, loss into strategy, and humiliation into a masterclass of subtle revenge. Margaret walked through the estate halls, her footsteps echoing with a sense of justice long overdue. The portraits of Whitmore ancestors seemed to nod in approval as she passed, and for the first time in months, Margaret allowed herself a quiet smile. Charles's betrayal had been painful, but it had also awakened a strength within her that she had long forgotten. The world saw Isabella Hart as a cautionary tale of hubris and inexperience, but Margaret knew the truth. The real power, the true legacy, lay not in wealth or titles, but in the mind and spirit of the woman who had endured betrayal and emerged victorious. Margaret Whitmore, once the quiet, devoted wife, had become a force of intellect and patience, proving that even in the later years of life, one could reclaim agency, command respect, and exact justice in ways that were elegant, effective, and unforgettable. Her story, whispered among social circles and chronicled discreetly in the annals of the Whitmore estate, would be remembered not just as a tale of revenge, but as a testament to resilience, wisdom, and the quiet, unstoppable power of a determined woman. And as she looked out over the sprawling gardens, the morning light catching the silver in her hair, Margaret knew one thing with certainty. Betrayal could take much, but it could never take the spirit of a woman who refused to surrender. She had waited, she had planned, and now she had triumphed. The Whitmore legacy was safe, not because Isabella Hart had inherited everything, but because Margaret Whitmore had ensured that justice, in its most refined and subtle form, had been served. No one would ever question her resolve again. And Margaret, the widow who had lost everything to deception, had proven that age, wisdom, and patience could create a vengeance more powerful than any fortune ever could.